really two common threads that were weaved throughout most of these articles. And the first is that they believe this country is moving towards, quote, a more reactionary moment in which the right is emboldened and that political violence becomes more likely. And the second is that Democrats, they say, are incapable of defeating right-wing reactionary movements. And this is why they push a socialist revolution, or this is why they push elements of socialism and communism. And the irony here is that the policies they propose to defeat right-wing reaction against socialism are historically the drivers of reactionary movements in the first place. One article that was from the Party of Socialism and Liberation, which is a very small socialist revolutionary party. They did have one member on the Seattle City Council. I don't remember if she's still on there or not, but she was the one, just briefly, she was the one who unlocked the doors to allow the Antifa rioters into the Seattle City Hall back in probably 2020. They propose things like universal health care and universal education and all these socialist programs. And they say this is going to take the wind right out of the sails of the right wing, because then the right wing will not be able to exploit any grievances, because there will be no grievances, because we'll have all these free things and it's going to be this great and wonderful utopia. But I find it really ironic because historically fascist movements have arisen out of direct opposition to Bolshevism. There's a really great book that I read back in 2018. I actually enjoyed this book. It was a book written by two left-wing professors. It is admittedly and undoubtedly a left-wing portrayal of this topic, but the book is called How Democracies Die. And they looked at, the two authors looked at probably a dozen or so cases of distress and decay of democratic societies. And the authors point out the many times right-wing authoritarian governments have taken over countries. And this is the entire premise of the book, the danger of the right wing taking over countries. Our democracy is in peril. It's really funny because they spend the entire introduction talking about how Trump is a fascist. And again, this is from in 2018, so Trump is president now. But they spend the entire introduction talking about how Trump is fascist, or he has fascist tendencies. These are the people who I believe popularized the term guardrails. Trump is removing the guardrails of our democratic society. And then finally, in the very last chapter of the book, they admit, yeah, actually, Trump's not a fascist. So I read that book and I said, well, this is kind of interesting. All these right-wing movements taking over countries. My initial reaction is that they just didn't take over healthy countries themselves because they woke up one morning and they say, this is a really great place. Let's just take it over and burn it to the ground. And so after doing some research, I found out that these two authors omitted a very important factor in their own book, which is that right-wing authoritarians most often intervene. Honestly, I can't think of a single time a right-wing authoritarian has taken over a healthy, wealthy country. But they most often, maybe always intervene in the face of growing left-wing authoritarian power. And the research that I did after reading that book, I found that this is the case where right-wing authoritarians really just beat back left-wing authoritarians. It seems like these countries were they were in a foot race because the left wing was in a rush to come into authoritarian power. And you have these conservatives who end up siding with fascists over communists. And that's the reason why the right wing takes over in these cases. It's not because these fascists just said, hey, let's take over this beautiful, well-functioning country. It's in direct response to the threat of communist revolution and Bolshevism. This is the case in Finland's anti-communist violence back in 1929, the Argentinian coup in 1943, and then a bunch of CIA-backed coups against communist countries like Guatemala in 1954, Brazil in their CIA-backed coup in 1964, Indonesia's CIA-backed coup in 1965, Chile's CIA-backed coup in 1973, Argentina's 1976 coup, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I do still believe that we are on a path to authoritarianism. I just cannot imagine 10 years from now, we will be freer than we are today. I can't, I guess technically as an intelligence analyst, I cannot say that I have an absolute certainty, but I'm almost certain that we'll be far less free in the future. And I do think the United States is on this path. And I'm not saying this is Trump. Maybe this is whoever comes after Trump. But I do think this country is in a foot race to authoritarianism. And it is just merely a case of, are we going to have a right-wing flavor or a left-wing flavor? And, frankly, that's, when I hear people say, like back when I was in Afghanistan, I first started subscribing to the guy used a pseudonym, Simon Black, and it was Sovereign Man. And he was also a former, I think he was an intelligence officer in the Army. And he was trying to get people to plant a flag in another country, have a plan B, whether it's Panama or Chile or Costa Rica, somewhere, places in Eastern Europe. And he was really pushing people. And he said, you have to plant a second flag. You have to have a plan B, because the United States, and again, this was back in 2010, 2011-ish, at a time when a lot of people were opening up to the idea of expatriating. So my bottom line here is that all these far left media outlets and the far left in politics, their policy proposals are going to have, I don't know if they're intended or unintended consequences, but they're fueling the right-wing reactionary movement, whether they realize it or not.